Hello, everyone. My name is Zainab, and on behalf of Friends of Palestine, Tanzania, I am joined with Mnar Muhawesh Adli, journalist and founder of Mint Press News. And today we're going to be speaking about Yemen because it's an issue that a lot of people don't know the truth about. Even though, many organizations are covering it and, asking for funds and selling it as a humanitarian crisis, which it is, the world's greatest humanitarian crisis of our time. It still has a lot of backstory that we really need to understand if we're going to do justice to the cause. So thank you, Mnar, for joining us. How are you doing today?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing very well. Thank you.
So can you just brief us on, what really is going on in Yemen currently, and how far back does this crisis go?
Well, yeah, the Yemen crisis began in 2014, and it is what you described it to be. It is the world's worst humanitarian crisis, targeted in an imperial war by Saudi Arabia and also the United States. But mostly, there's a Saudi-led coalition, which is backed by the United States through weaponry, arms, and billions of dollars worth of arms that is bombarding the Middle East's poorest country.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at Yemen and the history of Yemen, though, beyond the current crisis, Yemen has been basically the epicenter of the war on terror in the Middle East. The United States have been waging a major war on terror there, training of US militaries, targeting who they have referred to as Al-Qaeda, while plundering the country of its minerals, its oil, its resources, and controlling its ports, and then also occupying the southern part of Yemen in partnership with the United Arab Emirates, which we don't hear a lot about, but that's actually where many hidden atrocities are actually taking place today, where sexual torture sites are propped up, and people are hidden constantly. They disappear, they're taken there. Men and women are raped in these prisons. And this was actually, made international headlines a couple of years ago when it was discovered by an investigation by the Associated Press. And so Yemen, as we see it today, is really the target of a broader issue of Western imperialism and the military-industrial complex. And Yemen is an extremely important country to look at because, number one, there's a major media blackout on the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, where 23 million people, including children, are currently starving. There's a cholera outbreak that's seen epic proportions that has not been seen, since I believe like biblical times. And these are all man-made issues that have been brought onto the country of Yemen by Saudi Arabia, the United States, and its NATO allies. And then some of the countries that are also aiding Saudi Arabia in its bombardment of Yemen that we often don't hear about are other Arab countries like the United Arab Emirates, like Qatar, like Egypt, and even Israel, who is providing training and surveillance training to Saudi Arabia in its war against Yemen.
Mm-hmm. So who are the major players? I think you covered it a bit.
Yeah.
Who are the major players and what is their objective? What do they want?
Well, we have two sides here, which is the US Saudi-led coalition, which makes up Saudi Arabia, 100% backed and armed and funded by the United States through, I believe, a historic arms deal that was over $6 billion between the Trump administration and Saudi Arabia. And even before that, the Obama administration was, arming Saudi Arabia with, these historic and record arms deals. And then so that makes up Saudi Arabia, the United States, Great Britain, France, the typical NATO allies, and then we have Israel and Egypt, and then we have the United Arab Emirates, which make up the US Saudi-led coalition and its partners. And then we have this growing movement on the ground who has basically resisted this power structure which makes up the Ansarullah Houthi movement. And there are other factions, but that's like the major one that the US Saudi-led backed coalition is truly targeting and trying to weaken. But they're a grassroots movement who in 2011, the United States actually called, and this was actually something that was covered widely in the media, they actually called this group a very noble grassroots movement who was successfully fighting Al-Qaeda on the ground. But the second they overthrew the Al-Hadi government in 2014, now the Al-Hadi government was basically propped up by Saudi Arabia to serve the interests of Saudi interests, economic interests, and to basically ensure that Saudi has hegemony over Yemen. When the Houthi Ansarullah movement overthrew that government, all of a sudden, all we hear about now in the media is how the Houthi movement, the Ansarullah movement, and the Houthi movement is just another name for the Ansarullah movement. They are, a terrorist organization. They're being funded and armed by Iran. And so what we saw is the second this group was not working or turned against the Saudi government, which it wasn't even in support of even before that. But once it did something so strong and built this strong movement, this united front within the country to overthrow a Saudi and US-backed, basically puppet government that serves the interests of these economic, Western and Saudi economic interests, then the Houthi movement started to become demonized within Western media and even within Arab media to kind of paint, to basically paint the conflict as not a grassroots movement to quell and resist Western and Saudi economic dominance over its country and to try to establish, a grassroots government and democracy that would serve the interests of the people, because that's what the Ansarullah government is trying to do. The media started to paint this conflict because of how much influence American and Saudi money can play into the media. They painted it as a sectarian conflict because that's how wars in the Middle East are justified. If we can demonize the victims of our war, if we can demonize the people on the ground who are resisting US empire and the military industrial complex and the arms industry and the Saudi economic interests, if we can demonize them, then we can justify, and we as like the American media and the American military might, we can justify the arming of a despotic, major human rights offender, which is Saudi Arabia. We can defend this genocide. I mean, it literally is a genocide what's taking place in Yemen. We can defend these things if we paint it in a way like we're fighting an enemy. Like it's a sectarian war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so that's the really biggest unfortunate thing that has happened in this war, because the people in Yemen are suffering tremendously from hunger, from famine, from economic devastation, where food prices are so high, an economic and humanitarian blockade where Saudi Arabia, the very country that is bombarding and targeting schools and hospitals and civilian homes where over 100,000 people have died, is literally sitting on a human rights panel at the UN, basically dictating when and if humanitarian aid can enter the country, because they're pouring millions of dollars into the human rights panel at the UN. And so, as you can see, the whole the people of Yemen are really stuck under a very, very hard place in this conflict, and that's why there is a major media blackout. Because if Americans and the world truly knew the grave suffering of the Yemeni people, then they would be completely devastated and outraged that this was taking place at the hands of our U.S. taxpayer dollars, that our politicians are completely silent about this. And we have had some resistance within American media or American politics, like people like Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul, calling for a complete end to U.S. support to Saudi Arabia and its war on Yemen, but they don't actually go far enough. I've actually been pretty critical of even their resolutions that they've passed, because they call for the end of U.S. funding of Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, but they don't actually address this decades-long occupation of southern Yemen where people have gone missing. These sexual torture sites have, have been set up, committing grave human rights abuses, just like Abu Ghraib in Iraq. It's like, I mean, that's the level of devastation and abuses that are taking place in southern Yemen. And so I really think that we have to look at this picture in a greater form, which is, Yemen is a victim of the greater Western imperialism war on this country to take control and plunder its resources.
I know you've spoken a lot about mainstream media and how, and that's a huge, a reason why you started your own newspaper or organization, Mint Press News, and that's something that I personally, as a journalist, really respect and look at for my independent news and my just gathering my sources in the most accurate way possible. But can you, like, for our audience, can you elaborate on why is it that Yemen has been it's not been forgotten, it's actually been a covered up incident? And how is the mainstream media, doing that? Like, how are they able to push out a certain narrative so that everyone is on the same page, whether it's influencers, whether it's people promoting, even with good intentions, people who want to speak about Yemen are all, I feel, under the same, oblivion.
Right, and actually, I don't have the exact numbers, but we actually did a pretty in-depth report at Mint Press, and I wish I looked over it before this interview. I could have kind of refreshed my memory a little bit. But it was an article, it was an investigation that we had conducted about 2 years ago, looking at Saudi influence over American media outlets, human rights organizations, and media outlets in the Middle East. And I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but maybe it's something that the station can cite later. But Saudi Arabia is pouring millions upon millions of dollars into human rights organizations, basically pouring that money in to control what is being said about its human rights abuses in Yemen. And so when these human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International or the UN or whatever organization it is, they're going to come out with these manipulated numbers and manipulated narratives to paint it in a sectarian way, because they're actually pouring that money in to influence. And that's really the truth, is that money talks when it comes to these organizations. And they survive off of this money that's coming from major, from nations, because they can't survive off the donations off of just regular people. These organizations survive upon off of millions upon millions of donations from countries like the United States or from Saudi Arabia. And then Saudi Arabia, just like in the United States, we have a corporate media. The Middle East has a mainstream establishment corporate media as well that is also heavily financed. Heavily, I mean, I can't reiterate this enough. Heavily financed by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, by Qatar, and by Turkey as well. But because Saudi Arabia is so heavily invested in the war in Yemen, it's going to be pouring in such huge amounts of money into these organizations. And I'll take an organization like Al Arabiya, for example, or MTV Lebanon, an organization that airs in Lebanon. These are organizations that are basically owned and funded by Saudi Arabia. And if you look at their coverage specifically when it comes to the conflict in Yemen, they paint it as a sectarian conflict. They don't paint it as like this major human rights, of epic proportions conflict or issue that needs to be addressed. They cover it as, Saudi Arabia is fighting an enemy, which is Iran. Iran is trying to, they always like throw the Iran word out there. Iran is trying to take over the Middle East. They, the Ansar Allah and the Al-Houthi movement is basically a proxy movement of Iran. So Saudi Arabia has to go in there and fight them. It's a noble war. And so, but they never really talk about how the war got started and what the Ansar Allah movement's goals are and how this is like a human rights crisis. And then right here in the United States, the weapons industry, like Lockheed Martin and others, and think tanks that profit off of war, like the Atlantic Council. These organizations, they sit as fact checkers and news influencers for social media companies like Facebook and Twitter. And then I know that on Twitter specifically, like their Middle East, director is a former British mercenary. And so we have so many conflict of interest at play within the American corporate media establishment, where weapons manufacturers, people who, organizations and people who are, profiting off of the blood of Yemeni people, off of Yemeni civilians who are profiting off of the hunger, the famine that's taking place there. Those are basically the arbitrators of news here in the United States. And then we have this ongoing, issue in the United States about, we have to, quell Russian propaganda. We have to quell Chinese propaganda or Iranian propaganda. And that's really just a farce to take a tighter grip over the media through these social media giants, because most Americans and most people around the world get their news from Facebook, from Twitter. They're not going to CNN right away. They're going first to Facebook. They're going first to Twitter to check the trends and the headlines on social media. And so when we I was going to mention that Facebook has been caught censoring images of Yemen, of Yemeni children who are starving, the skeletal images of these Yemeni children that are extremely heartbreaking that have come out. Facebook has been caught, and they even did this to us with our own coverage of Yemen. They flagged our images of the starving Yemeni children and said that these images go against their community standards of providing a positive environment for readers. Facebook has consistently denied Mint Press's attempt to advertise and boost our documentaries and our video reports about Yemen. We actually have been self-censoring, trying not to show as many graphic images, just so that we can get through onto Facebook to show the crisis in Yemen. But we continuously get denied the ability to promote posts because they go against their community standards. And what are these posts? All these images and documentaries that we're producing are just showing that there's a humanitarian crisis in Yemen. It's funded by the United States and Saudi Arabia, and it's something that we have to take action on before basically another Holocaust takes place in Yemen. And it's all preventable.
Wow. This also reminded me of the UN and how Saudi actually blackmailed the UN to remove them from the blacklist. And UN is such a big, I guess, name that people drop, especially as Americans. Like, we really look up to the UN. We really trust the UN. But even the UN is so tainted with, they sit in the Human Rights Council, and they're the biggest, the biggest violators of the human rights. So I don't know, like it seems to me that, it's very, very difficult for people to come out of this and say, and see the truth, because they're all working together to kind of make us blindfolded as to what's really happening in Yemen. And I'm glad for, organizations like your Mint Press News and other watchdog organizations that are shining light where otherwise we would pretty much be blinded as to what's really happening. So do you have any advice for people on how they can search for the right news? You mentioned social media. I feel like as millennials, we don't even, I don't think I've ever gone on CNN or Fox News I think it's outdated now. We don't even have newspapers. Everything is on social media. So what is, I guess, your journalist perspective on how people can get their news?
Well, I think the first thing is we need to acknowledge and recognize just how powerful social media has been in bringing down governments in the past, and also promoting social movements around the world, like we saw during the Arab Spring. And so that was a real test to show just how strong social media can be, which is literally the reason why the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, these weapons manufacturers, and other special interest groups, even if it's big pharma, they are really trying to take a tighter grip on social media under the guise, again, we have to remember this, under the guise of targeting Russian, Iranian, and foreign sponsored media.
Mhm.
All of that is just a farce to have a tighter grip on social media here in the United States. We
Mhm.
should never, ever, ever support any form of censorship, because if one organization is censored or one person is censored, it only justifies a censorship and silencing and removing and deleting and deplatforming of other people and other voices
Mhm.
that do not sit well with establishment narratives. And it's really important that millennials recognize this, because a lot of the organizations that are doing this, that are partnering up with social media giants like Facebook,
Mhm.
are what I like to call hipster propaganda outlets like Vice News, BuzzFeed, whose target audience are millennials. But even these organizations are heavily influenced by weapons manufacturers, by the State Department itself, by former, Obama aides and Bush aides, people like Bill Maher, who's, an Islamophobe, who's a Cold War, promoter. And so we have to really be careful of falling for these media organizations. And so I want to say that first before I talk about what organizations to follow, because first we have to recognize what the problem is,
Mhm.
and we have to recognize that it's happening. And once we recognize that, then we can say, okay, what are the solutions? And the reason I bring that up is because a lot of people don't even recognize or even know that these so-called hipster propaganda outlets are hipster propaganda outlets. They don't even understand, because they're so good at targeting millennials to pull them in with their, really edgy and cool coverage. When BuzzFeed has, a little, video that goes viral about like colors of hijabs, or let's, cook with our Indian mother or something, and we're, it makes us like, okay, we can relate to these videos, and like we share them and they go viral. But then when they share, fake news, which is what I like to refer as real, actual fake news, and they promote like sectarian narratives to justify wars in the Middle East and in Yemen, people don't catch it. They don't catch it because it's like, oh, well, BuzzFeed isn't Islamophobic. It's not pro-war because it posted these things. So they're very manipulative. And so we have to turn to independent media organizations that are not financed by special interest groups. I mean, that's being independent means it's not receiving corporate money or money from special interest groups. That's really the definition of independent media. Obviously, I'm going to promote Mint Press as an organization that has been heavily covering Yemen. I mean, we literally broke the media blackout. We did an online campaign to break the media blackout about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And we've done a really successful job in garnering international media attention about what's happening in Yemen, and really like correcting the media narrative about what's happening, and also providing the coverage through a humanitarian lens and saying, politics aside, whatever you want to believe, let's put the people of Yemen first and look at, these people, what they're truly suffering on a daily basis. So Mint Press is obviously one of them. I would also recommend the Empire Files. Actually, my good friend Abby Martin, she launched this organization. It's a documentary film organization, and she actually just did a really incredible documentary on Yemen. I would also recommend, it's independent as well. In the Now, the Gray Zone, these are also truly independent media organizations that hold the establishment accountable. So these are things that we have to look at when we look at an organization if we want to trust it. Is it independent? Is it receiving money from corporations and special interest groups? That's number one. Number two, is the organization holding the government and establishment and these special interest groups accountable? Is it working in the interest of democratic values and in the interest of human rights and the people? Is it dividing us, distracting us, or is it actually informing us and helping us be better, decision makers and better human rights activists within our community to promote justice and peace? So those are things that we have to look at. And unfortunately, it is just a handful of organizations like that exist today. And I know, Zainab, you do a lot of incredible work in bringing attention, so obviously I recommend everybody follow you as well.
Oh, thank you, thank you. You're everybody knows you're my inspiration. Honestly, this is why I got into journalism in the first place. But I what I found really interesting is what you mentioned about how the mainstream news keeps talking about Iran. This
Right.
whole Iran, it's been something everywhere. And can you tell us why this whole Iran thing is far fetched? Even though obviously we know that they morally, I guess, support the Houthi movement, the Ansar Allah movement, just because it's a resistance movement against a common enemy. But why is this narrative, like, to the audience, like, people are wondering, why is this far-fetched? Why can't this be true? Why can't Iran want to take over the Middle East? Because they're obviously against Saudi and Israel and all of that, right? So they might have their own agenda.
Right. So if you look at just the United States in the last 100 years in all of its conflicts, there's always a common enemy in every region of the world. When the United States was heavily involved in, arming Contras and overthrowing, socialist leftist governments in South America, the big, boogeyman at that time was Cuba. Be careful of Cuba. Be careful of, socialism. And that was like the big, be careful of communism. Those were the big, boogeyman keywords that was being used to justify all of the human rights abuses that the United States was acting on in South America. When it comes to Africa, if you look at, the coverage there, it was the same thing to justify its coverage, its support of apartheid South Africa. I mean, the biggest sponsor and supporter of South Africa was the United States. I mean, we were literally arming the apartheid regime there. And then now, people like Nelson Mandela was demonized as a terrorist, right? So when it comes, so with every region, there's a narrative that's crafted to fit in with that demographic. And so when it comes to the Middle East, Iran just happens to be a really good, target of Western imperialism. And it's very clear why, because, Iran has been sanctioned for over 60 years by extreme, heavy, and very damaging economic sanctions by the United States for overthrowing a US puppet regime of the Shah, and to basically rebuild their government to be a democratic one and one that resists any privatization of its oil and gas industry. Iran nationalized its gas and oil industry so that the people of the country could actually benefit from the profits and the money-making scheme, instead of having, the British or the United States take all of that profit. Because that's really what it comes down to. The United States wants to have hegemony, economic hegemony over the entire world. That's why it is considered the largest empire history has ever seen. That's the goal. That's the end goal, is to expand US empire. And the only way to do that, whether it's militarily or economically, is to demonize a common enemy. And in the Middle East, within our media, it's a very Islamophobic media. It tends to paint all conflicts in the Middle East as sectarian. And so it's easy to paint Muslims as barbaric. They've been fighting each other for thousands of years, we're told, constantly, constantly, constantly. We're told that the men in the Middle East are, very aggressive. They're anti-women. We are told to believe that women, can't drive, and they don't speak up for themselves. So all of these narratives, they all, I should say caricatures, they kind of each fit into this puzzle to build this narrative to demonize countries like Iran and paint every conflict in the Middle East as sectarian. If we can paint everybody in the Middle East as barbaric, backwards, violent, then it will justify, this, what is it, like the freedom eagle coming in. The freedom eagle, America's coming out. He's coming in to save everybody. It's not about oil or money or anything like that. It's not about that. Our media tells everybody that it's about us bringing democracy and freedom, and we're here to restore order. And that's why we need to support our troops, because our troops fight very hard to bring freedom to the United States. But
Mhm.
that's really not what these wars are about. You know,
Mhm.
the attack on Iran is an attack on its economy. The attack on Yemen is an attack, it's just an attack on its resources
Mhm.
and its oil and gas and the ports. And Saudi, since Yemen is connected with Saudi Arabia, the Yemen, like the Gulf of Aden, is where all Saudi oil enters into the, you know, into the world. And so that's why Yemen has to be controlled, and that's why a sectarian narrative has to be crafted to support this. And Iran does not fund or arm the Houthi movement,
Mhm.
or the Ansarullah movement, even though U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, for a very long, she's not the UN ambassador anymore, but under the Obama administration, she was the ambassador, and all she did
Mhm.
day in and day out was pull out, you know, have these Houthi Ansarullah missiles on display, proving during her presentations at the UN that Iran was arming the Houthi movement. And actually, Mint Press had journalists
Mhm.
and people on the ground that went in and
Mhm.
showed that Ansarullah was actually manufacturing all of their missiles. They were all homemade and man-made. And
Mhm.
so part of the reason that the United States didn't want to show that they had these capabilities is to not show how strong the Ansarullah movement actually is. They are winning the war.
Mhm.
Yes, it's a grassroots movement. Yes, it's a small movement, but it's a highly united movement and
Mhm.
highly sophisticated and highly motivated movement.
Mhm.
You know, with that's, you know, willing to go to all ends to
Mhm.
build their own materials, that were, by the way, much of the materials that they had to make to build these missiles, these very sophisticated missiles, were
Mhm.
left there previously 20, 30 years ago by the Soviet Union, or more than that, probably 30, 40 years ago by the Soviet Union. And so they have these capabilities to build these missiles themselves. But if the Ansarullah movement were to be shown for their strength and
Mhm.
their capabilities by the media, that would be extremely destructive for the powers that be, because it would show
Mhm.
and it would motivate other grassroots movements that, hey, you can resist
Mhm.
world empire. You can resist these heavy-handed countries like Saudi Arabia, that's receiving what, over $6 billion worth of weaponry each year from the United States. A small organization like Ansarullah has the capabilities, but they're not going to show that, because that would actually give motivation and inspire other grassroots movements to fight and resist
Mhm.
Western imperialism.
Yeah, that's what also, I'm always dumbfounded when I think about how the Houthi and Ansarallah grassroots movement, these simple folk basically are winning against the greatest military powers of our time. And I read somewhere where it said that, Saudi mercenaries are actually foreign mercenaries, because Saudi doesn't send their own people to fight them. And that's, I think, the huge difference is that, they're cowardly in their fight against Yemen. I mean, they're weaponizing the food, they're targeting the civilians, they're literally killing innocent people to put pressure on them to disarm. And like you said, the Ansarallah movement have nothing to lose at this point, and they will go at all ends with their faith and their motivation. And I think it has already sparked a lot of, movements and a lot of inspiration to a lot of different resistance groups. And I do believe, I guess I want to know from your angle, what do you think is going to happen, like in terms of your projection with how Yemen is going to rebuild going forward? Are we going to see an end to this war? And what is necessary for us as, Westerners and Americans, and even people watching this in Africa? What is necessary from us to, I guess, help this movement and help them gain their freedom?
Well, it's hard to say what exactly will happen, but I know that the war is coming to an end soon. When, I don't know, but I think that it will be coming to an end soon. Saudi Arabia has used up all of its resources in terms of its military, in terms of targeting Yemen, and they really are losing on the military front. They know they are losing. I mean, Yemen, Ansar Allah's movement, has fired missiles into the heart of Saudi Arabia. It's targeted its oil fields. They're not afraid, like you said. They have nothing to lose. The country is on the brink of like death and genocide, and they're still able to resist and fight and respond to Saudi Arabia's bombardment. And so Saudi Arabia sees this. And so there actually right now is taking place as negotiations behind closed doors every week, trying to figure out how to bring this conflict to an end. But when you're dealing with countries like Saudi Arabia, and it's like, you know, very egotistical and despotic leaders, you really don't know what they're going to have up their sleeve next. And people in Africa, you know, Africa has been a country that has been targeted for centuries. It's been plundered by, you know, European nations like the British and the French. Their resources exploited, and so they know firsthand, you know, the experience of living under imperialism, whether it's, you know, America or European nations or NATO. This is an ongoing struggle. It's not ending. You know, the same countries that are plundering Yemen are plundering Somalia, are plundering Sudan. And so the first thing that we have to recognize is we should not fight or fall for these sectarian narratives, whether it's through religion or race or creed or gender. We have to work on being so much more, you know, smart and so much more, you know, powerful than the powers that be, and unite on a grander front. You know, no matter what race or religion or ethnicity or whatever it is, and come together and see that there is a global class war going on. At the end of the day, every single conflict, whether it's in Yemen, whether it's in Venezuela, whether it's in the Congo, where the people there are being plundered for their cobalt, or Sudan, or Somalia, no matter where it is, or even in China, where the United States is targeting China in an economic war. All of these conflicts can be broken down to an global economic war being waged by the West's billionaire class, which make up literally 1% of the world's population. They make up less than 1,000 people. Less than 1,000 people, think about that, that are basically accruing all of this wealth. People like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Jeff Bezos, you know, these and more, so many more people that make up about less than 1,000 people who are profiting off of all of these conflicts, all of this plundering. And we just have to remember that they're less than us. They are less than us. And so we have the power to stand up to them if only we recognize the power that we have. It's like being in an abusive relationship, right? You know, the person who's abusing you makes you believe that you're powerless, and they continue to abuse you. They make you basically their slave, and because they treat you, they hurt you, and they dehumanize you constantly, regularly. They put you down. They make you believe that you are powerless. But the day that you recognize your power and you stand up to them is the day that they fall down. That abuser is taken down. And so that's what we have to recognize, is the power that we the people have, if only we knew.
Wow, that's powerful. To wrap this up, I think that, you know, this year has been something.
It's been something.
To put it lightly. I mean, and that's what I want to kind of touch upon as we end this conversation today, is that, you know, things are happening, right? One after the other. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So many of us are jobless. Many people have been affected by this pandemic, especially. I can't speak for people in Africa, but I know that, you know, people in America are going through a lot of things. You know, I'm in Canada currently. People are going through a lot of things. Middle Eastern countries are going through a lot because I've worked with them personally. And so this level of uncertainty, right? And there is this thing happened with Beirut, and you know, this assassination happened with General Qasem Soleimani, and there is, you know, we don't know what to expect. Anything can come tomorrow, the day after. And, you know, I feel like, you know, as journalists, we can both appreciate that things are always going to keep happening in this fight for justice and injustice. Things are always going to keep happening. So how do we keep this pace up? Not everyone can be a journalist, not everyone can speak out, but everyone can do their part, right? So I guess, how do we, like, as we go forward with the rest of the year, and end this conversation today, how do we keep this focus and really come together, like you said, and unite, no matter what our roles are in society, no matter what we're doing, whether we're activists or not, whether we have full-time jobs or not? What can we all do to keep this, momentum forward?
Well, we have to continuously keep ourselves informed, and sometimes it's going to feel exhausting. And we have to remember that self care is extremely, I mean, we talked about this before we
Yes.
started. We have to take care of ourselves and our families first. And we have to continue the conversation and challenge even our own beliefs and our own stances, and challenge even our own selves on a day-to-day basis, whether it's through, taking care of the environment, recycling. I know it sounds like so small, but it's something that we have to look at. Helping the poor and the orphaned, helping the most needy people within our communities, even if we have so little, but always be willing to give so much back, and treating others with so much kindness. These little acts of kindness and justice, they have a ripple effect throughout the world. And the more we push positive energy and loving energy throughout the universe, it's all going to spread and create a really big wave of love and hope and justice. I know that sounds so like cliche, but that's really what it's all about. It's what you do on a micro level that truly, truly matters. I mean, when we look at these problems and these issues that are taking place in the world, like, we think these are so big, and how can I stop the war in Yemen? Genocide's taking place. Like, we think like we have to just do it all, but we can't do it all. We have to recognize that there's only so much that we can do. And it really starts at the micro level. And if we can focus on that first, then we can take on bigger steps and bigger things, to bring peace on a broader level. And that's really what I like to share, because that's more tangible for people. They ask, what can we do? It really starts at the micro level. Once we start there, then we can take larger steps, to protest, to speak up, start our own blog, and then join organizations. And that's really how it starts.
It's amazing. Thank you, Mnar, for joining me, and I hope you guys found this segment beneficial. If you want to check out her work, you can follow her on social media. Mnar Muhawesh. Do you have your handle?
Yeah, it's Mnar. Mnar Muhawesh Adli is my name on Twitter, Facebook, and then on Instagram it's Mnar MPN for Mint Press News.
And you can check out Mint Press News. They do amazing work, and all the other independent outlets she spoke about. And you can also check me out, as Zainab writes. So stay brave, stay free, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.